Did you know that in the next 7 years, the UN projects that 118 million people right here in Africa will be exposed to droughts, floods, and extreme heat conditions? This will further aggravate the food insecurity for millions of people on the continent. Well, if you didn't know, now you know. And that's why we are discussing climate change and the threats to Africa on the square today. My name is Keminni Amanor, and you're welcome. You're watching Village Square Africa. Many thanks for choosing us today. Now remember that Village Square Africa is now Monday through Thursday at 2 p.m. West African time. Now to the business of the day. Extreme weather conditions manifested as floods and never before seen droughts are some of the effects of climate change visited upon Africans. Deserts are fast expanding, eating away farmlands and contributing to the food insecurity on the continent. Famine and droughts in the Sahel regions have claimed thousands of both human and animal lives. In Western Africa, heavy floods have drowned communities, consumed livelihoods, and swept along with it the lives of Nigerians, Chadians, and Cameroonians, among many other nationals. In all of these, we see the dire consequences of climate change on the real people, real lives. And it has been admitted that the continent contributes the least to climate change, but suffers the most of the consequences. Now this year, world leaders are meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt at the 27th Climate Conference to rectify and hopefully ratify the climate injustice done to Africans. But what will really change? What must Africans know about the changing climatic conditions, and how can you help? Let's meet our guests on the square today. Gerald Leparillo is environmental activist from Nairobi, Kenya. Ebere Akwuebu is environmentalist from Lagos, Nigeria. And then we also have Dr. Dorothy Bassey. She's CEO of Fortnumglobal Consulting Hub, which is a regulatory and compliance consultant in health, safety, and environment. Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome to the square. Now, I'll start with you, Ebere. COP27 has been ongoing for a few days now. Are you hearing the things that matter to Africa yet?
Yes, there are so many things that have come up in relation to what is happening in Africa. For instance, I'll use the example of what I know that's been happening with the women gender constituency. And they've had a lot of demands, and part of it is, okay, we need to increase finance for loss and damage in Africa. And in line with what we term the climate justice structure that everybody is trying is agitating for right now, which is, okay, the countries that are causing the issues are the ones that should be able to provide funding for other countries that are contributing less to the emissions to be able to manage their own situations. We all know that climate change is something that affects everybody across the world, and with the United Nations report that says that things have gone as bad as in the last 125 years and all that. And whatever it is that we're seeing now that you mentioned earlier with regards to the flood, sea level rises, the drought, everything is all related to human-induced climate change. So with what is happening in COP, yesterday, while I was listening to one of the proceedings online, I understand that some countries are actually making contributions, particular sums of money to targeted towards Africa for loss, particularly for loss and damage, to manage the potential impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Dr. Bassey, anything impressed you yet as far as the 27th Climate Conference is concerned?
Thank you very much. I would say it's the same rhetorics, commitments, recommendations, pledges, and all of that. And until we see concrete action, I'm not sure we're going to really move as much as we would want to. But my message really is this. I don't expect the West to solve the problems of Africa. I don't expect it at all, because they also have their problems. Though the West has contributed more to the issues of climate change, I would want Africa and Africans themselves to take the bull by the horn, because we are most vulnerable. They have put in place several resources, they put in place resources, funding, and you can actually see what they are doing to curb the changes we're witnessing today. It did not just happen overnight. It has been on for a long time. And if you recall, the first attempt to draw attention to what is currently happening was at the Kyoto Protocol, 1972. That's a long time ago. Now we're at COP27. Next year it will be COP28. And it goes on and on. But when will the action start? That is my question.
We'll talk about. That's a really important question you have asked, and I hope that we can dig down into that in a bit. But let's introduce Gerald into the conversation. Gerald, once again, the climate conference is reiterating mitigation and adaptation, and this time he hopes to narrow down and focus particularly on financing. What are your thoughts on the fact that he wants to make sure that the monies that are promised to African governments get to them to deal with the repercussions of climate change? Well, I think we lost Gerald over the phone. I'll come back to you, Dr. Bassey. You say that Africans should not expect these industrialized nations who are contributing a whole lot to the climate problem to deal with the repercussions that we see on our continent. Why so? Dr. Bassey, can you hear me? Dr. Bassey? Well, I'm not sure Dr. Bassey can. Dr. Bassey, you're muted. In the meantime, let me go to Ebere while we fix the audio problem with Dr. Bassey. Ebere, you have a question I posed. Dr. Bassey made mention of the fact that it's time we looked at our own ways of dealing with the problem. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I quite agree with her. But if you look at it from another perspective, all the challenges that are posed by climate change are peculiar to the different regions and countries and all of that. So that's probably why she has that she shares that perspective. And indeed, it is quite true. But, because most times in Africa, we tell ourselves we don't have funds. And without really looking inwards to say, okay, what are the things that we can do that to address the challenges that are peculiar to us? So, but then we still will need these funds. And then one of the things that has plagued Africa is bad governance. So because of that, it's not always very easy for us to be able to address these challenges as they come. Take an example of the floods that ravaged different parts of Nigeria in the last couple of, in the last month, I think about 4 or 5 weeks now. What are the things that have been, there's nothing really concrete that has been done aside. Who have been the people providing succor to the victims of this flooding? It has been private individuals. Government has not really done that much to be able to do this. So that is why I think, that is why in my opinion, we're still always thinking about looking for outside remedies to be able to address our inside challenges.
In the last several years, the continent has partnered in dealing with some of the problems, as you said. We know about the NDCs, we know about the SDGs, and a few other programs from the African Union as well. My question is, if we have been implementing all of these things, is there something we are not doing right, such that we continue to see the dire consequences of climate change here in Africa?
Well, what we need to understand is all of these initiatives that you have talked about, they're all policy oriented. Okay, what is it for instance, the NDCs? What are the actions that Nigeria wants to take in these all the areas that it has aligned in its NDCs? The challenge is not in coming up with these policy documents. The challenge is with implementing them. So as they come up with all of this, and then aside from that challenge as well, there is also the political will. So we had the MDGs, it expired. we didn't know what was the progress, what was the scorecard. Did we achieve up to 40, 50% of what was on the MDGs? And now we have the SDGs, which will also expire in the next 2030. And it is still the same thing. All of these things are presenting the same patterns of remedies. And at the same time, we're not getting. So with all what is going on as it is now, we're having increased impacts of all of this, all of the climate, we're having increased impacts from climate change challenges. We have to move forward. More action, less talk. That is what is going on in Sharm el-Sheikh as we speak. And then let me bring a gender perspective to it, okay? With all of those things, what is it that I would ask my own question? What is it that is being done to be able to promote women's interest in all of those things? Because you find out that when all these challenges come, who are the most vulnerable to all these impacts? It's mostly women and children. It is not to say that men are not also affected, but then you talk about vulnerability, it is the women. Who are the people that are easily left behind in the wake of all of these things? It is still women and children. So if I want to bring the gender perspective into it, it is to say, let it be that women are giving more voices to be able to give their views, and I think women take better action in implementation of certain structures. For this climate change, we're saying climate justice. We're saying give women voice. We're saying include women in decision-making processes. And at the same time, let it be that as it's coming down from the, well, we have a top to bottom approach, from the top to the bottom, it is that everybody is carried along in the sphere of.
Very well. Dr. Bassey, it's good to have you back. Now, I was saying earlier that you make mention of the fact that Africans will need to start looking inwardly to deal with the climate change problem. And I was asking, it would seem rather unfair to Africans who contribute only about 3% to this global problem. What are some of the ways that we could help to make an actual difference?
For first and foremost, I think everybody needs to understand that the climate change issues concerns everybody, from the top to the bottom, to the man on the street, to the woman in the village. It concerns everybody. And so for me personally, I would be more interested in more advocacy, more awareness, because you need to take charge of yourself. You need to take charge and you need to understand what is happening around you. Well, you could say that the flooding was a very, very bad and negative thing. However, it has brought that message to the doorstep, to our doorstep. And so we must begin to ask the right questions. We must begin to task ourselves and not wait for government to do anything. Because if we keep pushing the buck, these are the kinds of things we will be saying. I'm happy my colleague said something about getting more women involved, because we are the nurturers. We are the ones to pass that message to the youth from the home right up, not from the top down, because women and children are the most vulnerable. They are the ones adversely affected. And if you look around, talk about food security, talk about security itself, talk about displacement. Look at the pictures. It's telling a lot. And so for me, it's more of advocacy, more of awareness. What are the things we need to do individually? For government, I don't want to say much because we are not really seeing much.
So I want us to understand our vulnerability. What makes us so vulnerable to the climate threat, Ebere? Ebere, you're on mute. If you could unmute yourself, we'd hear you.
Sorry, I didn't know I muted myself. Okay, so everybody, cities are home to half of the world's population, and there are sites of economic activities, and then definitely there will be emissions everywhere. And then, science is telling us that the emission levels are rising because of industrial activities. What makes us vulnerable, you say? Yes. Are we vulnerable because of our peculiar topography? And then because I used to say that environmental impacts are sans frontiers. By that I simply mean what can be happening in one place is able to affect in another place. And again, I'll use the example of the floods and sea level rises. All of those things in a way are intertwined rather, okay? So it doesn't really, I'm not talking about special vulnerability now, because for Africa, for Nigeria particularly, we have, I don't want to say government again, because Dr. Bassey just said something about not really pointing at government. Our own behavioral tendencies is what really makes us vulnerable. There are a lot of things that we don't take seriously. If you want to bring down to one of the minute causes of flooding, particularly in urban centers within Lagos State, within Nigeria, you find out that the people also contribute to that, because people are throwing things and people are people are throwing things around, not improper waste management, improper buildings, codes, obedience to building codes, improper infrastructures in place. All of those things enhance and increase vulnerability. So on a broader scale, it would be the peculiarity of the situation of any region that will make it to be vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Another example is in the north. They are very close to the desert, and so when water scarcity hits that region, what happens? There is going to be drought. So I think for me, it's really about the peculiarity of any place that makes it more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Dr. Bassey, are some people more vulnerable than others on the continent in that they would experience, the consequences much more than others?
People living near to the coastal areas, I would say, are the most vulnerable because of the rising levels in the water. People in the north, for example, in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, the rising temperatures, and like my colleague said, Mrs. Ebere, these are things that are caused by our daily and day-to-day activities. So if, for instance, I know that I can't do without the air conditioner early in the morning, why would I put on the air conditioner? Although the environment has no barriers, however, if you go to a typical home, all the air conditioners are on, right from morning till in the evening. These are little things that we need to begin to teach and let everybody know that your activity would contribute. And though you may not directly or immediately be affected, cumulatively, the impacts pile up. And this is what we're seeing. Because, like I said earlier, climate change issues, the threat to humanity has been recorded since the early 70s. But we're still talking about it. We're still negotiating. We're still making recommendations. And so for me, I don't like to talk about it anymore because we need to take action. We do not have any more time. We really do not.
So, and we're hoping that our conversation today would enlighten many more Africans to, some of the changes that we could make in our lives as we demand action also from those who are polluting our ozone layer the most. But while we are on the subject of some of the activities we do that expose us more to vulnerability, let's talk about deforestation and the exploitation of our vegetation for natural resources such as the minerals deep in our earth. How do those things, Dr. Bassey, affect our living on the continent, really?
When we talk about deforestation, I would like for us to also look closely at biodiversity and the role the spectrum of species play in ensuring that the habitat stays intact and continues to provide the resources for man. So if you talk about deforestation, it's not just about cutting down trees, it's also about the the different species that will be displaced, that will be lost, and no effort being made to replace them. Because sometimes when you talk about deforestation, people are thinking, oh, okay, it's just cutting the trees and planting. No, you have a lot of biodiversity in the soil, in the environment. And so people, again, it's all about educating our people. It's all about knowing the interactions. It's all about taking responsibility, because they are all linked, like Mrs. Ebere said. Everything man does is interwoven to give the perfect state of existence as we know it today. So if we continue without recourse to what is going to happen in the future, then the word sustainability, it's not and void. Because what we want is to enhance, rather than when you destroy, you walk away and you go to the next place, you take without making any efforts in replacing. So for me, that is my take on your question.
Very well.
We need to understand the interactions.
Ebere, when we look at...
okay, so sorry, let me add to what Dr. Bassey has said, okay? What she's saying in very clear terms is what we call intergenerational equity, okay? So you're taking, and then you're also putting something back. For the deforestation that we talked about, one very simple way that we're being encouraged to try to mitigate this is to do what? When you cut down one tree, you plant another one. These are things we think that are supposedly elementary. But you see, they have what I call a saving grace at the end of the day. The little trees that you plant as a cutting off another one, you're trying to replenish. That's what she's talking about. You're replenishing what has been taken. Like there's this thing we say within the environmental sector: when you keep on plunging nature, it will want to fight back, and that's what we're getting now. So the call of action is on everybody. It is like Dr. Bassey earlier mentioned, a call to action to everybody. Advocacy is key. Advocacy is one area that you can't finish it. You can't finish doing it. You have to keep on doing aggressive advocacy, and then also working towards what I call changing behavioral tendencies, letting people do some kind of reorientation for people to know that, look, you're doing this is possible to cause this kind of harm. All of these things are some of the ways that we can actually start from the bottom now, going up to the top. Thank you.
Very well. So I'll stay with you, because I was going to dig into the exploitation of our vegetation for oil and minerals and all these cash cows that people outside of the continent are very interested in. How can we hold them more accountable as far as our environment is concerned, Ebere?
Sorry, what did you say again?
I'm asking,
sorry, I didn't get your question.
How can we hold the people who exploit our minerals, they exploit the oil down our airs? How do we hold them more accountable for the things they do to our environment?
Okay, so we have laws in place that provide sanctions for defaults, for non-compliance with environmental regulations. And then when these laws come to play, but then you know there are a lot of dynamics with the law, in the sense that the laws are there, but then are they being complied with? And then if they are there, and then they don't seem to serve the purpose for the current day reality that we have, what should be done? So it's another laxity that falls back on our governance structure. If the law is no longer serving its purpose, then there is need for that law to be reviewed, and at the same time, reviewed in line with modern day realities. What we say, okay, in line with international best practice. So yes, there are people who may be defaulters. The law prescribes for what should be done. There's always a sanction prescribed for every act of default. Are these sanctions being implemented? And then sometimes you find out that government wields the two kind of stick. If it is a large corporation that maybe works in consonance with government activities, there might not be, the stick will not be welded towards that. But you have smaller corporations that might be, and then the big stick is welded. But if there is across the board implementation of sanctions, then I think I would have said that we would be working towards addressing issues of non-compliance, and then those who default are properly dealt with.
Very well. Dr. Bassey, I want us to look at the other non-state actors, the private sector who do not necessarily engage the environment directly, and for that matter have sat unconcerned about the climate situation because they feel they do not contribute to it. What do you have to say to players in that part of private sector, and what can they do really to help the continent to deal with the climate problem?
I'm happy you mentioned that, because really and truly there are lots of companies or sectors that are not direct, whose activities do not directly impact on the environment. Their responsibility is to support and sponsor climate adaptation activities. They all have an environment desk or environment officer in their establishments. For example, take the banks, for example. But you really don't see them getting involved in environmental activities. You don't really see them sponsoring, like they would sponsor Hollywood or Nollywood. You don't see that. And that is my call, and that is what I would really want to see happening. Because what we're talking about involves money. It involves a lot of funding. It involves strategic planning. They have the resources, or they have more resources to support and drive advocacy in Africa. And
but they will say they will only put the money where their mouth is, in the sense that really it doesn't affect them directly, even though they contribute some to it.
But events have shown that it's affecting them. Like I said, sooner or later, it's going to affect everybody. Because, okay, if everybody is wiped out, who's going to go to the banks? So that's a very myopic way of looking at it. The environment has no borders. There are no boundaries. So what happens in the south definitely will affect what's up in the north, as we are seeing. So I would say again, the sector you've just mentioned now, though do not impact the environment directly, have a critical role to play. And as responsible corporate entities, I think they should be the leaders in climate message, because that's a different ballgame altogether. Now we're talking with environmentalists, we're talking with academicians. But what is their role? Where are they?
Very well. I'm told that, unfortunately, Gerald is now joining us again, making a last-minute show, and hopefully we can get a few words out of you, Gerald, this time. Many thanks for your patience, Gerald. We've been discussing the climate problem here on the continent. Gerald, in Kenya, you've had your fair share of the impact of climate change. Tell us how the country has been dealing with it so far.
Hello?
Gerald, did you hear me?
Hello?
Gerald, yeah. I'm asking that you tell us from the Kenyan point of view how you have been dealing with climate change consequences. I'm afraid I can't hear you, Gerald, and we are winding down the conversation. I apologize you could not share your thoughts with us. I'll stick with Ebere Akwuebu, who is environmentalist from Lagos, Nigeria, and Dr. Dorothy Bassey. She's CEO of Fortnumglobal Consulting Hub, which is a regulatory and compliance consultancy in health, safety, and environment. Now, Ebere, as we wind down, I want us to localize the issue of contributors and, the people who then become victims, if you like, of climate change, and then talk about the haves and the have-nots on the continent. Because when the problem comes, it's usually people who are on the outskirts of town who are consumed by the floods and the droughts. And so what would be your advice to the African watching you now? What are some of the changes they could be making in their lives on the personal level?
Okay, you know, I work in the CSO sector, and one way that we've tried to help out with these things is to speak to people and do what I call elementary ways. I mentioned that earlier, how you can actually solve some of the challenges. For flooding, you try to tell people, okay, clear your drainages as much as you can. People shouldn't really build very close to the fragile coastlines. And for people whose natural habitats or heritage homes are close to these places, they're advised to try to do some sort of embankments around these areas, except where it is just drastically not possible for them to do anything when the palliatives that they have may not be able to work. And then for planting trees, I mean, you can't do enough of that. And I also want to just dabble in a bit into what Dr. Bassey mentioned earlier about the private sector leading in the climate change advocacy. It's something that we call environmental and social governance, ESG. It mandates the private sector basically to be sure that they are able to tell us within their governance structures what are the environmental considerations that they make, how are they implementing them, and at the same time, part of what we don't want to use the word. I don't want to use the word CSR again. It goes beyond that. Okay, if you look at it from the NGO perspective, it is now the organizations actually helping around within their environment to help to mitigate potential environmental challenges. And I want to commend those private sector organizations that donated so much during this flooding incident. It's part of what we're talking about. But then, like I also indicated earlier, we have to have what I call a thorough reorientation of our people. And that's why I do community advocacy as well. So when you go to the communities, you try to tell them what it is they can do on their own to try to help themselves and reduce the impacts of whatever challenges they might have at the end of the day. And usually, the best people to approach are the women. I'm sorry, I'm still going towards gender and I'm making reference to women again, but these are the people that are easily able to adapt to these things, and then they replace in the homes because they raise the children and then they make it come across board. But we still need a lot of advocacy. Advocacy is key. We can't do enough of that.
Very well. Dr. Bassey, I want you to touch on preservative actions that we could take as a continent as we continue to charge at developed nations to pay for the damage they're doing to the continent.
We need to be more focused. We need to be committed. We need to set aside funds, and we need to educate our people about the effects and the things we can do individually. That is the only way, if you ask me. Thank you.
Very well. Ebere, I just have a few minutes, and if that's okay, I want to spend that on you. There are those who'd say that really Africans and those who are suffering from the effects of climate change cannot adapt to hunger. There's absolutely no way out of that. They cannot adapt to the fact that their homes have been flooded. World leaders are paying attention to COP27. They're paying attention to climate issues because of the times we live in right now. What would you say to them regarding their ability to meet their pledges that they would support the continent in dealing with climate change consequences?
What you said just now, I didn't get you.
I'm asking about the need to make sure that the world leaders, those from the developed nations, pay up for the damage they're causing to us.
How to make them pay up?
Yes.
Well, basically everything they do from like last year in Glasgow, when we were at Glasgow last year, there were certain commitments there are certain contributions that were made financially and all of that. But you have to understand that these things are done voluntarily. So they are voluntary contributions, they are voluntary agreements. And then it depends on whether they now ratify it or they don't ratify it to be able to compel them. Even at that, I don't, in my own understanding of how the process is, there is not really any compulsion. So if the government says, I am going to donate X, Y, Z, and then possibly for some reason, like Dr. Bassey indicated earlier, they have their own internal challenges, they might not be able to live up to that. We've had different voluntary instruments that have come up over the last decades, more than from, like she mentioned earlier, from when climate change issues, when environmental issues started and then global discussions started, up till the present day. We are at the 27th COP. It means that there have been 27 meetings. There have been contributions along all of these times. So who has held anybody responsible for not meeting up with that contribution? I don't think I have a fit to cap response to that question.
Very well, ladies. I guess that is the problem. We'll find out how COP27 at the end of the conference deals with it, whether or not there'll be something concrete that will make sure that the $100 billion promised us is paid. I appreciate your time here on the program. Remember that we are on from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Mondays through Thursdays. Thank you so much, Ebere. Thank you so much, Dr. Bassey. I am Keminni Amanor. Goodbye.